webinar, we are going to get started. So you are here for a BioRAFT EHS Community Connection webinar series. This one is titled How to Gracefully Shut Down a Lab Group. Now, before we get started, I wanted to make an announcement. So this is actually going to be my last time as a host for the BioRAFT EHS Community Connection webinars, but don't worry, we've got Jonathan Klane on, who's going to be taking over the series in my stead. So helping the scientific health and safety community is something that is a part of our lifeblood as a company. You know, BioRAFT loves to help everybody and be a part of this community. And that's why we started these webinars back in May of 2020, right when COVID was rising up. And we saw that there was a real need to bring everybody together, to offer everybody support and encouragement, and a place to come and talk while we were all figuring out and navigating this brand new world. And now, over a year later and more than 30 webinars after that, we are still going strong thanks to you, our community. It's just been really fantastic to see everybody continuing to come back, talking about these things. I feel like I have learned so much just about all these topics and about the real ins and outs of managing scientific health and safety from everyone. But the webinars also take a lot of time to put on and a lot of energy. And now that we have Jonathan on board, he's going to be able to help lighten that load a little bit, and he'll be able to take on the responsibilities of organizing and hosting these as well. So I'm really excited to see him take these on, see how they'll flourish and grow under his leadership. The next one we're doing is going to be all about applying behavioral sciences to scientific health and safety. And I think that that's going to be a fantastic conversation about leveraging behavioral science to get actual tangible effects and improvements for your scientific health and safety initiatives. So just wanted to let everybody know, and really excited to see how these are going to change and grow with Jonathan as well.
Thanks, Matt. I speak for everyone when I say Matt has done just a phenomenal job of creating and building and nurturing and running these, and I've got very big shoes to fill and appreciate everything, as I know all of us in the community really do. It's been wonderful. It was something that the company felt strongly about to create during COVID, and we're just so honored that you all have blessed us with, you keep coming back for some reason, and it just goes to show that our efforts and what Matt has really done have paid off, and I'm very, very excited to be part of that.
Great. Well, thank you, Jonathan. And I'm really excited to get into this conversation here. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and continue. So we have with us today our panelists, Lori, Sean, and Jonathan, and we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of how to shut down a lab group with grace and confidence and all the things to kind of diffuse that situation and make it go smoothly. So first, we'll start out by going through a brief overview and background, give a little introduction about who our panelists are, their engagement with the subject before we get into our questions. Now, a brief reminder. So in the Zoom webinar control panel, you'll see a button marked Q&A. Now we have a live and active Q&A at the end of these webinars in the last 15 or so minutes. It's always a fantastic chance to talk with our panelists, get your questions out there, and hear from each other. We have it set up so that you can thumbs up the questions you're most interested in. That way we can prioritize the answers that are most popular. And also you can respond to each other's questions. It's not all information that's going to be bottlenecked just with our panelists. This is really an opportunity for the whole community to share its experiences, questions, and knowledge. So definitely, as we're going through, as questions come up, don't wait to put those in. It's always great to see conversations going alongside our conversation up here on the video panel as well. All right. Well, Lori, would you mind kicking us off and telling us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I started out as a lab manager in research for about 15 years at UT Southwestern. And then I did a brief stint in private industry at an oncology company. From there, I went on to manage all of the chemistry teaching labs at Texas A&M Commerce. And I finally landed at my home here in UT Dallas. So, wearer of many hats.
All right, thank you. And Sean, would you mind going next?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Sean Fitzgerald. I way back, I used to do research into select agents as part of the RCE program up at Harvard. I transitioned to biosafety, laboratory safety at Harvard for a while, and then went down to Tulane to help with the remediation of the Burkle-Dairy incident. Got them going up and running and kind of looked for a new task. And now, as Lori mentioned, I wear a lot of hats up here at Hackensack Meridian Health. helping with their new School of Medicine and the Center for Discovery and Innovation. This is where I live now.
Fantastic. And Jonathan, would you mind closing us out on this portion?
Yeah, sure, you bet. Hey, everyone, Jonathan Klane. I work at BioRAFT now as our Director of Risk Management and Safety Education. So I work with Matt and the others on our team to try to create this engaging content for the community. Prior to this, my career was, a lot of it was in consulting for a couple of decades plus. Got involved in advising a variety of clients on matters, including what to do about labs and processes that needed to be closed or moved or whatever. But a lot of what I'll probably end up talking about today is for a number of years, I worked at Arizona State as safety director for the Ira A. Fulton Schools of Engineering. So I was what's called an embedded safety professional. I wasn't in the EH&S group, but I worked with them hand in hand as partners. But I and my chemical safety specialist were the people in the unit trying to work behind the scenes, oftentimes, to help others gracefully shut down a lab, as we're calling it today.
Great. Well, I'm excited to hear about all of your different experiences and perspectives, and we can go ahead and jump into our questions here. So the first question for the group, what situations or factors lead to requiring a lab actually getting shut down, just to kind of set that stage? Sean, if you'd like to get started with that one.
Yeah, I think, I think when people, at least I'll tell you myself, when I first heard of this topic, the first thing I thought of was sort of a penalty or some bad adverse event, maybe some gross negligence or fraud or things like that. But it really is sort of two sides of a coin here, where we can have that, certainly, but also it can just happen for unfortunate reasons. We have folks that lose funding. We have groups that sort of shut down, focuses that change, research funding differences change, and really it ends up having to really shift priorities, needs at a very quick pace, and that can really throw things for a loop, and that can lead to having to sort of repurpose, remanage, reset spaces at a moment's notice. And I think, as prescient in all our minds during the current pandemic, is that funding needs, funding abilities have changed dramatically. And the scope of these areas has changed dramatically. And I think I'm sure a lot of people attending this webinar are currently dealing with a lot of these issues too right now.
And Lori, from your experience, what causes these labs to get shut down in the first place?
Well, I agree with everything that Sean said, but something we experienced over the last summer was a whole department moving to a new building. So that's kind of a unique one. You can also have safety issues, lack of compliance with regulatory requirements, and faculty leaving.
Yep. Jonathan, anything to add there?
Yeah, just really briefly, I mean, very much what Sean and Laurie have said. We've had faculty pass away, very sadly, obviously. I was amazed when I got to ASU that within engineering, we just had so many different applications going on that as you tried to figure out what was the best place for research to go, we would end up moving labs back and forth. It was almost like this ongoing chess board of relocating people. I was really amazed by that, So there was that. It's a shutdown, but then it's a restart. Funding shrinks, problems. We had a bio lab have problems with the IBC, having to temporarily shut it down, and we had to help get them back up to where they needed to be. So things of all sorts of natures contribute, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And in the chat, Sridevi has to add retirement. And also from my own experiences, a little thing called COVID can sometimes cause labs to get shut down, and other natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, and other reasons. It's not always about the permanency of the matter. So then what are the pieces and the parts of cleaning out and actually managing up to leadership when it comes to shutting down a lab? Lori, would you mind starting us out, telling us a little about the different parts of the process?
Not at all. I think you posted the documents that I sent you, that we've got a flow chart that kind of describes our process. We start with a pre-closeout notification. so that we can very closely coordinate with the faculty member that's leaving by sending an email to the faculty member and keeping the department head in the loop. And then we schedule a meeting to actually review the lab space with students and the faculty to determine a timeline for the tasks that need to get done. When we do that, we establish dates and provide them with equipment decontamination forms, which we require, and lab closeout forms, so that everyone's on the same page. We also provide guidance regarding any closing of license, like DEA license and stuff like that. So.
Sean, any parts of that you'd like to contribute as well?
Yeah, I think, Lori's process is spot on. I mean, that's what we want to do in an ideal scenario. One scenario I had recently on a much larger scale is we actually had, one thing I think some folks can probably sympathize with is that healthcare and research don't always understand each other very well from an administrative standpoint. So we had a healthcare research building for preclinical research that ended up having to be shut down and was getting repurposed. So a lot of PIs were sort of on their move out. It was kind of a mess, and some of them was a little bit combative, we'll say. And we had an issue where we had 2 or 3 labs that were basically completely abandoned. So it's like basically someone kind of just left, abandoned chemicals, abandoned other hazards, abandoned all sorts of stuff. It was really one of those big headaches. And I think one of the things we had to do was, the first walkthrough we're going through with administration, they're like, all right, well, we can get this done in 2 weeks, right? And it's like, whoa, hold the phone. This is not remotely how this works. So I think what we really had to do at that point was really translate, the regulatory burden of dealing with these hazardous materials, the burden of decommissioning these laboratories, how we can actually get these things out of the laboratory, get this laboratory to a safe point to transition to a construction phase. And a lot of it was breaking down the complexities of things we deal with on a daily basis to folks that just don't have this remotely in their lexicon. And I think that's one thing that I'm sure is part of Lori's process too, because we all deal with upper research administration folks that don't necessarily deal with this sort of thing on a daily basis. But it's really the burden becomes on us to really translate the things we know inherently as safety professionals to an audience that doesn't quite grasp the complexity of it. I mean, we had to get a tractor trailer in from our Hasways vendor. We had to bring in outside consultants to help us sort materials. I mean, it was a lot of heavy lifting just to get this to a point, and it did not take 2 weeks like they were expecting. So it's really setting up a lot of realistic expectations and really kind of making sure that folks are really understanding what steps are needed to really get to the end of the finish line in these transitions.
Yeah, I think I would just briefly add to this that these unclear or unrealistic expectations that we've been talking about have been a big part. My role was always managing up within my unit, but that would include, vice deans and deans and all of that sort of stuff, sometimes outside of my unit, but mostly within. And unless you're, I think as Sean and Laurie are saying, unless you're in the middle of it, and unless you really understand the complexities, it can be hard to have them understand why you can't just pick up a freezer and move it when the freezer has a huge block of ice and no one knows what the heck is inside the ice. And you can't just thaw it, randomly, right? Because it could be reactive either with water or with air. And so these oddities and complexities that absolutely affect timelines and who can do what when are, I think, one of the biggest challenges to help people really understand how it may or may not go.
So it sounds like from listening to the three of you, a big part of this is also how do we effectively communicate the knowledge we already have about all of the hazards and woven throughout the situation to people who normally don't have to interact with these hazards. Are there any outlooks or perspectives that you find when you're trying to figure out how do I find the right words to help this person really understand why what I'm doing is important, why I need to do what I'm doing, that are useful for you?
think analogies work very well. Really trying to sort of figure out, general broad analogies, honestly, things that seem totally unrelated, are exceedingly helpful in these situations. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head, and if I remember one that I've used before, I'll pop it up here.
Great.
But I think it's really trying so we all struggle to do, I think, on a lot of things, is really try to convey this sort of information across many different knowledge levels. And I think it's really kind of making sure that you're putting yourself in that person's position, because it can be a very stressful thing for safety professionals. I'm sure, I've felt it. I'm sure you've all felt it. It's suddenly, you had a PI that had, 25 gallons of xylene, and then he's suddenly out the door, and then you're like, what? I gotta, these sort of things. Suddenly my generator status is going to shift. I've got to figure out how to deal with all this paperwork. I have to let all these other groups know. So you're dealing with all that stress internally while you're sitting there and trying to convey that to someone who basically has no grasp of what you're discussing that you're responsible for. So you really got to kind of like translate it in a way that they can grasp it. And I think, Jonathan, I'm reading Jonathan's panelist thing, and the empathy piece is really important. I think it's empathy for all those involved, which is really hard to do when you've really got a thumb on you, really pushing you to the limits. But it's empathy for the folks that are departing, and empathy for the folks that, have to try to deal with these complexities with you and really kind of bring them along. And I think that helps a lot.
And I think you also have found to take cultural differences into account with the way you communicate with people.
Definitely.
Yeah. As Sean was, and maybe Sean will come up with one of his analogies, but because I'm curious, but as he was saying it, I was thinking back to some of my interactions. And of course, this was pre-COVID, so a lot of in person. I always made sure I went to someone else's office or lab or whatever to talk to them on their territory, get to know them. And to Lori's point as well, culture, we often, you can see my backdrop, you can see a lot of this oddities that I've got, but it gives you great opportunities to really talk about something meaningful for the other person. So, if someone says, John, what's the, how the, why the, whatever, and maybe I can quick think and go, well, I had one PI, so I'm from Boston, as we were talking about, and he had a huge New York Yankees banner in his office, and we kidded about it. And he would ask me, and I'd say, Ed, imagine that you're the manager of the Yankees and you're trying to field it, and you've got all these players, and you have no idea what their talents are. You don't know what this person does or that person does or whatever. How do you know where to put them? And, if that sort of analogy for them that you've already got a relationship with works, as I think Sean is saying, it's a really weird, broad analogy, but if you can make the bond with them, I think that goes a long way towards it.
And Lori, you said something earlier that I was curious to learn a little bit more about when it came to considering and being sensitive to cultural differences around communication. Were there any particular examples that you kind of come to mind that you could talk about?
Well, I just try and look at it from their point of view and be respectful. I try and educate myself on different cultural differences so that I can act all inclusive with whoever I interact with.
Okay, fantastic. And I was actually going to ask you another question after that one.
Sure.
You've been talking a little bit about how do we communicate effectively with people who aren't normally involved in EHS when a lab is being shut down. But who are the people that we normally need to talk to in those settings? So what are some of those roles in the different individuals?
So we have found it very helpful over the last year. Since COVID shut down, we've really worked at building relationships with administration because they relied on us when the labs were shut down in order to maintain things during the interim. And so we talk with the provost and project managers and involve the department head and the deans, along with the faculty and students who are leaving the facilities. We also talk with facilities management, the safety team, which includes our waste team, housekeeping personnel, because they need to not come in and just try and clean stuff up before we go through the area and remove all the hazards, that kind of thing. So we try and be cognizant of who all has a stake in turning the space over.
Sean, Jonathan, anything you'd like to add there before we move on?
Yeah, one thing to add to that too is the be mindful of your direct colleagues too. I say this is the person who's had big EHS departments, and then currently now it's just me and one other person under me. But you have a lot of different disciplines in those offices. Sometimes in our EHS groups are always spread thin, but these labs all have multiple different hazards. Lori's mentioning radiation, laser, chemical hazards, physical hazards. They could have all sorts of animal work. So you can really kind of build a coalition even within your own department. And some of those folks might even have better connections and better relationships with those upper management folks that you need to build that piece to. The one thing too to think about is one thing with lab closures, even the smoothest lab closure, there's always money involved. It costs things, and budgets are a tight thing and a hard thing to comprehend too. So I think when we talk about those expectations and building those relationships and those people involved, you got to make sure you have the right money folks involved, because if you need a tractor trailer to get rid of hazardous waste, that is definitely a very expensive proposition, as we learned in the BioRAFT webinar a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of webinars ago, excuse me. But it's one of those things where you really got to make sure you have those resources and use everything at your disposal.
Yeah, I would just add, again, having been embedded in the unit, I would be the one, for the most part, working with my colleagues in the unit. So at both ASU and UC Davis, my counterpart was an associate dean for our facilities needs. So I was always interacting with him as well as his project manager quite a bit. So I would then interact with EHS. Our facilities guy would interact with a larger university-wide facilities department. And those make total sense. But then you got to keep in mind, this is a research operation, and there's a lot besides money. There's a lot of requirements, paperwork, et cetera. And so I would have to interact with the research administrators also to make sure we were closing down for the grant and taking care of all of those different things, and would always have a lab manager or two or three from the department that they weren't embedded in the lab. They were actually working for the school, and they would be a key person as well, doing a ton of behind the scenes, moving around and communicating.
One quick thing to add too, build those relationships now. I think that's the most vitally important thing. We're talking about situations where you get notification. More often than not too, you don't get notification. Then it's like, we need to sort of take care of this now. If you have folks in these departments you work in, I'm not saying you have to sit there and be best friends with everyone, but build those relationships, get to know the lab managers, get to know the research personnel, the administration. Oftentimes they can be eyes and ears and maybe even give you a heads up. If you got a little bit of a heads up, that can make a world of difference in these situations. And then, because I'll tell you, and again, I'm sure everyone will agree with me, safety is one of the last people to get notified when there's large construction projects or movements and things like that. So we got to fight for any information we can get.
No. Imagine if it were just an earlier notification, you could step in and save everybody a lot of time and money there. And if you're ever struggling to figure out, how do I actually reach out to this person who doesn't know me, and kind of create more of that known quantity, just referencing COVID and saying, hey, if COVID has taught us anything, it's that safety sometimes needs to crop up in unexpected ways. So I wanted to introduce myself. I'm this person and I do these things, and it would be great to learn a little bit more about you in case we end up working together in the future. Just great sort of miscellaneous opening that you can do a lot with, and that'll really warm people up to you helping them and not asking for something from them. So getting on to some best practices and more practical advice for how people can actually go about shutting down labs. Could all of you share a few best practices or things that come to mind when it actually comes to shutting down a lab? What would you recommend people make sure to do?
Well, I'll jump in one quick one. I would say make sure you can almost do like a sort of pseudo lab inspection. What do we do with our lab inspections, right? That's always sort of the first thing. It's really a sort of catching of things, right? That's where we get those chemical inventories. That's when we see new equipment. That's when we see personnel. I think, you almost do a pseudo one of those that kind of gives you the ability to really take stock of what's going on in that laboratory. Sometimes, even potentially dangerous equipment in our larger institutions where you have hundreds of PIs, sometimes things can come in, new processes, new procedures, and sometimes those chemical inventories are 364 days old. So you really want to get a grasp of those things, make sure you have good hard information of what's behind those doors. So you make sure, because you want to have that in your stock ready to go for whatever interactions and conversations you're going to have.
Now, before we get to you, Lori, I just wanted to thank everybody who's found their way into the Q&A so far. There are already a lot of great questions and discussions going on, so definitely feel free to jump over there with any questions, especially since the chat can tend to get a little buried and it's harder to keep track of those things. So definitely feel free to get over there and answer each other's questions and ask your own as well. And Lori, it looked like you had something that you wanted to add to this question about best practices.
Yeah, I wanted to say it's really good if you could try and get a defined process set up and communicate that out to the labs and administration. It's really helped us a lot to be able to do that initial email and say, here's your checklist. This is what we need you to do. This is how we need to be involved with it. So that's helped us a lot.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to this is just two things. One, every problem I've ever seen has some element of communication. And so one of my common best practices is I've never seen a problem from over communicating, but boy, have I seen a ton from under communicating or miscommunicating. So, I mean, I think that's very obvious to all of us. I think the other is make sure that you designate, and everyone agrees, that there's a project manager who's really, running it, at least managing, as Laurie's saying, the process and keeping everyone apprised of what's going on, as Sean was saying too. And then it's lastly, very helpful to designate, what are people doing? What are the roles in this shutdown, in this move, in this transfer of stuff, whatever it is. It may not be their title, because that might not be obvious, but what's the role for the purpose of this project? Because it really is a project that you've got going on.
Yeah. Of course, we do best practices to ensure, we don't make as many mistakes, kind of keep everything smooth, but also to make sure that we are flexible enough to react to unexpected things when they do crop up, because so what, always expect the unexpected, right? So what are some of those hidden things that do tend to crop up when you're shutting down a lab that you wouldn't necessarily expect? Jonathan, would you like to go first on this one?
Yeah, sure, that's fine. I'm sure that Sean and Laurie and everyone on this webinar will think of legacy chemicals, hidden stuff, because you're cleaning out everything, right? And as you're pulling stuff out, you're going, wait, what's this? Whatever solid material, there's no label, all of a sudden you're trying to triage how bad could this possibly be? So I think that's one of the first things that I think all of us think of, because I think we've probably all experienced it. Oh, we've found snakes live and dead. You just tend to find all sorts of odd things, maybe things that the lab did that you go, who wired this thing together this way? And now you've got to bring in the trades to take care of stuff. And so you get a lot of these odd surprises of things. And I think it's best to be prepared for almost everything. And I see Sean is nodding his head in agreement. So I want to hear what he, and Laurie too, what they have experienced.
No, I told this story when we were doing the warm up. And I think a few people have mentioned it, but we had at a previous institution, we had a principal investigator that was an emeritus professor, and he passed away. And we did sort of a hazardous chemical buyback program, like those gun buyback programs. So it was sort of complete amnesty. We'll take it back. We'll get rid of it for you. And it kind of relates to this too, actually. If you have the resources, I would highly advise doing stuff like that for the institution, because it really kind of clears the decks. And one of the things you find in these labs, that you have a principal investigator that's been around for 20, 30 years, or, they tend to be hoarders. I can say that as someone who was a researcher. We tend to want to hold on to everything.
Yes.
So we found mixed bio and chemical has of a human nature that would definitely alarm some folks on this call here. I won't alleviate the details, but it's one of those things where you really want to make sure that folks are being current with their materials. They're cleaning things out. You want to be aware of these things, because what will happen in these labs, you'll go in and you'll find, chemistry bottles from, 40 or 50 years ago, and you'll find high haz materials. You'll find things stored in places you would never have imagined. And I think it's really, you got to brace yourself for that. Things that would never been put on their chemical inventory that should have been there for a very long time, or things they forgot about. And it can be really a scary proposition, and really can be something to really keep track of. I think that's one of the most important parts, in my opinion. That we've had people suddenly discover radiation material. I told Lori this, but radiation materials from decades ago, from scientists that had left years ago, that no one had really taken care of. It was a freezer full of irradiated material that ended up costing the institution about $450,000 once they discovered it. So, there's hidey holes, there's nooks and crannies in all these old institutions we all work at. And I think you really just want to be aware of everything is and what it is, and find ways to get people to get rid of stuff they don't need anymore, because they don't need all that stuff. We all know that.
Yeah. So we use our annual inventory rescans as an opportunity to do that and talk with faculty and try and get them to get rid of items that are no longer usable, from the 60s, stuff like that. But I would say also, just a cautionary point to our fellow safety professionals: always look before you leap. Don't go digging in drawers and touching. Just look at it and see what's there first, because you will be surprised at some of the things you'll find.
We had people reach above cabinets and cut themselves on slides, cover slips, syringes, that you go, why are people putting stuff way up top above a cabinet? But I think Laurie's point cannot be overstated, that don't be reaching in or above or whatever where you cannot see. It can come back and bite you, literally or figuratively.
That's where I put my broken slides to keep them out of the way. So when I get rid of them, eventually,
Very top shelf.
One of these days, yeah, that's where I keep my.
I need them later, definitely.
Well, it's convenient in the sharps containers far, so I just throw them up there where nobody's going to touch them. Why were you reaching up there anyway?
So sad.
Yeah, and I think in the same vein of a very common theme for healthcare, that preventative care is the way to prevent a lot of downstream issues that end up being more costly and more problematic. Same for your laboratories, that same way of getting at that radiation issue before it happens or immediately right after it does. Getting to those places, getting to those cleanouts, having the necessary equipment, being able to go through for those regular checkups can just make a huge difference than going in at the end and suddenly realizing, oh my God, there's all this stuff here that I've never had to see before. Great. So in this vein of unexpected things that tend to crop up, have you ever experienced an unexpected departure where all of a sudden, without much warning, suddenly a lab group has to be shut down or transitioned or in some way altered?
Definitely.
Lori, would you mind telling us a little bit about your kind of experiences with that?
Sure. So we had a faculty member who did leave suddenly, and it was an interesting situation because most of the materials in that lab were bought with startup funds. So we got contacted by the provost's office to preserve that space for a new faculty member who will be moving in. So that was kind of a unique situation, because you know how everybody is. Oh, I heard so-and-so left. Let's go see what's available in their lab, right? So we had to work with the department head in the provost's office to somehow secure that space and inventory everything that was there so that they would be aware of what they could offer a new faculty member.
Yeah, I think that's such a vitally important point to make, Lori, is the fact that you need to make sure, because people love of any free things they can grab, and oftentimes exactly what she said, if you're not securing these areas, suddenly things grow legs and suddenly they have new homes at extant parts of that institution. So it's really important to keep track of materials and make sure that if that green light is given for rehoming things, and rehoming is wonderful, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one less thing we have to get rid of or throw away, but we want to make sure that the folks getting those things are appropriate to get those things, understand what they're getting, and then it's the thing that's safe for them to be utilizing. Because I think we had a few folks with those sudden departures, and it felt like a flea market, and we had to almost go locks to lock those doors, because it was was out of hand because we had a lot of people on those, exactly what Lori said, startup funds, grant money's tight, and they want to get anything they can possibly put their hands on to help those research things go ahead, which can be good, but it has a negative effect also.
Yeah. How do you tell whether someone, hey, I lent them this laser and they're gone, so I want to get it back now? How do you figure out whether that's actually the case, or you've got the buzzards, circling the dead body and wanting to pick away at this lab and scavenge, whatever they think they can or is appropriate. And so it becomes a great challenge to really figure that out when you've got, as someone posted, as I mentioned, as a lot of us have experienced, they pass away. There's a very, I'll just say, abrupt departure, voluntary, not voluntary. Maybe I, as the embedded person, find out verbally, and it's like, John, don't put anything in writing, but would you let the right people know and figure out what to do about this? I mean, it can all of a sudden become quickly very much a political hot potato.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, getting to Jonathan's point here on the slide, people are humans with emotions. So especially in the event that somebody leaving for any number of reasons abruptly can be really upsetting for the members of that group, whether they're a grad student, a technician, an established scientist with a really close bond to that person. Maybe there's a lot of tension in that space and there are some kind of vindictive elements present. There are lots of very complicated interpersonal dynamics that can happen within a lab group. So being sensitive to those, talking to people can really help save you some headache down the road. If not just because it'll stop people from getting in the way or making things easier for actually going through the logistics of clearing out a space, but it can also just make communication a lot easier, help keep people more receptive to your messaging and paying attention to your emails instead of feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, well said, Matt.
So,
Well said.
Yes.
Getting on to the current topic that is just sort of omnipresent in our lives everywhere, COVID. So how has COVID affected your ability to shut down labs, either in frequency, in severity? Has it changed any of your workflows, either for the better or for worse? Is that something that, Lori, that you found has been a impact on your work?
Yeah, it was quite an impact on our work. The university decided to close everything when COVID came out, and we were low on staff. Our whole staff was not here, but faculty were just suddenly told, hey, don't come back, right? And they left experiments, they had equipment that needed to be maintained and stuff like that. So our team stepped up and surveyed the whole campus, turned off water baths, stuff like that, so that nothing was a safety issue. And then ever since then, it's allowed us to build a really good relationship with all of the research faculty on campus, because they relied on us to do stuff like fill liquid nitrogen doors once a month, things like that, so that when they came back, their lab could get up and running. So I think it was a good thing as much as it was a bad thing.
Sorry, as I was a little muted there. As a previous, scientist in a past life, just thank you for filling those doors. We have in my lab, we had so many invaluable, patient-derived cell lines that were truly unique present in those things. And man, if scientists care about one thing, at least biologists, it's their cells.
Mm-hmm.
Cells and mice. Sean, anything that you felt like COVID has impacted your, process of managing lab shutdown?
I think, we've had a lot of scientists that have pivoted to a lot of COVID research, especially being linked to the hospital. So we had a lot of work that didn't necessarily get shut down, but we had a lot of musical chairs. So we had a lot of labs where we'd sort of do kind of a soft shutdown, pivot them somewhere else. We did have a few folks leave. I think one of the toughest parts has been really emphasizing the fact of multi-use spaces and really trying to make sure that, as we design new areas, as we have stuff set up, it's a multi-purpose space that can be utilized not for specialized activities. That makes those moves and those closings and those things much easier, because it's a lot less to sort of have to, again, it's a losing battle sometimes, right? Because we really need to go where that funding is, but it's something where we really have to sort of retrofit spaces, and we have to sort of decommission some things and then set them up in a new place. That's really been what we've dealt with. We haven't had to deal with too many of these COVID linked shutdowns, but the repurposing is tough. And I'm sure, once, hopefully when we get, this is all in our rearview mirror at some point, a lot of that will wind down, and we'll have to sort of repurpose and shut down some of those spaces. And that's already things that we're, at least not thinking of actively, but it's in the back of our minds about how to handle these areas that have been stood up in response to COVID, and how to sort of how we're going to deal with repurposing those areas when the focus of research is not on the pandemic and on these sort of things.
And Jonathan, is there anything that you'd like to add there as well? And in addition to just shutting down labs due to COVID reasons, also ways that COVID has made standard lab shutdown processes more difficult, that for folks who may not have had to go through the process of shutting down a lab group during COVID, may be able to kind of anticipate and learn from ahead of time. Yeah,
I was at UC Davis during the first half-ish of COVID. And so we went through the process, that Laurie and Sean have really talked about. And it became my overarching role to really work to help the labs with that as much as possible, and figure out who needed to give approvals for what. The process of granting approvals as stuff was then being put back in place was a little opaque to people, to say the least. And so it was just a ton of communicating. And if anything, I think it just emphasized the needs for good communication and a good process and role definitions as well. And then the last thing I'll say is trying to help people really understand the value of what everyone is doing, especially with the widely varying risk perceptions that we had from COVID.
Yeah, and I will say one quick thing to add too to that is when we have labs that don't inadequately move out, and then we have a new lab that's going to be repurposed in that space. That's happened to us a few times in COVID. And that can always be a hard thing to capture too, is, we have a researcher who has a very heavy, process with flammables or something like that. And then we have a new lab coming in that's going to work on brain cancer. And that lab maybe was a little bit more messy the first time, and now we have to turn it around in a week, and their PI is off to the races somewhere else doing something else. So it can be a whodunit and run situation. And that can be very difficult to deal with too, because you're doing a closeout and a move-in at the same time. And that, to Jonathan's point, the communication and setting expectations appropriately with the new scientists, because we all know too, these people do not like to stop work for even a moment's time. So they want to be working right to the last moment, move to the new lab, and they expect to be starting those experiments that 10 minutes later. So it's really kind of making sure they understand this is not going to be this is a process that we have to work through. It's not going to be the same every time, and we need to make sure that the expectations are appropriate for everyone involved.
Then just to build off that a little bit, Laurie, have you found any particularly effective ways of managing expectations around getting a lab, back up and running, or doing a lab turnover, or shutting down a lab?
Yeah, I think communication is the key. I mean, like Sean said, anything can happen during the process of closing out a lab, and you have to be really flexible in what expectations are and keep everybody on the same page, just to keep the closeout moving in a timely manner.
Yeah, I'll add a brief thing. Figure out who can do what easiest and best. So like packing up of chemicals for the move, if EHS is going to do the physical moving, but the researchers are going to do the packing, are they really well equipped and well trained? Or is it worth asking for a favor from EHS, or maybe they're very willing to do so, and for some level of assistance there, just to make everyone's life easier? Because the last thing you want is a bunch of researchers or scientists doing a job that all of a sudden EHS comes in to move it and they say, we can't move it this way. They haven't packed it properly. So trying to do a pre-mortem on that and say, guys, listen, let's have the professionals do what professionals do. And let's have the others take care of, their equipment or something like that no one else wants to touch.
And one little quick thing too, do a service to your colleagues too. One thing, when you have PIs coming in and you have those interviews about, where you're going to be coming in, what you're going to be bringing with you, it helps to educate them on what to make sure they get rid of before they come. And that can help, our colleagues at other institutions that have to deal with that lab closeout too. Maybe get rid of those things, those high hazard chemicals, buy new when you get to your new institution, be cognizant of these things. And it can be a service that can really help you down the road if you have to help make that lab, go away in the future, but also you're going to help one of us that's having to deal with that at that home institution currently too. So I think keep those lines of communication open with your colleagues, talk to your folks at those other institutions. They can really help along in that process. We're all in this together, I think. I know we've heard that a billion times with COVID, but it goes with this too, I think, as well.
Absolutely. Well, somehow we are already at 4 p.m. Eastern here. So we are going to transition over to the Q&A in just a few minutes. So a big thank you to everybody who's already contributed there. And definitely go over into that Q&A tab and ask your questions. I will be able to have your fellow attendees answer them and provide their own feedback, which I personally love about the webinars. But before we move on to that, I'd like to launch a quick poll and ask you all to go ahead and take a moment to participate in that. So these are the EHS community connection webinars. We rely very heavily on you, our EHS community, to keep them going, whether it's from helping us know what topics you're most interested in, to also volunteering as panelists. A huge thank you to Lori and Sean for donating their time and energy to make this space possible and to make this discussion possible. So if you would be interested in being a panelist on a future webinar, if you think you have somebody who is in your network, either a colleague or a coworker or somebody else who you think, man, this person would be a great panelist, they'd speak really well, they have a lot to share, let us know. We'd love to reach out to them and keep these going. In addition, we have a few upcoming webinars. In 2 weeks, we'll have applying behavioral science to scientific health and safety. After that, we'll be talking about evaluating hazardous chemical reactions and how to prevent any unexpected surprises from the people who are performing chemistry at your organization. And our newest one, this one is chemical safety for non-chemical hygiene officers. Looks like there's an old title in that one, but this is going to be chemical safety for non-chemical hygiene officers, helping to distribute and disseminate more information about just chemical safety for non-specialists. Great. So moving on to our Q&A now. I'll leave the poll up for a little bit and give everybody a chance to respond. First top question is from Ahmad, asking, how about if you have a lab that is not operating due to lab safety hazards? So have any of you had to shut down a lab due to a safety violation or safety hazards, kind of requiring that action?
Yes, I can take this one. I just did this a couple of weeks ago. So the lab did not know or was not aware of what they needed in place. And this all happened because the faculty member came in mid-COVID. So we got with the department head and met with him and discussed what needed to be done with him. And he is working with us to get things so that this faculty member can get his research up and running again, because they're in the middle of publishing papers right now. So
got it. And how's that been going so far, the communication? Does it feel still very collaborative?
Well, there have been some communication breakdowns with, we had to get FM involved to move some furniture out, and that was not well fleshed out. So we're still working on that issue in order to get the other safety issues resolved with this lab to get it back up and running. But yes, I had to go in today, in fact, and just kind of talk with everyone involved and say, okay, here's what I heard from everybody. Can we get on the same page? Please reply all so that everyone knows what's going on, because sometimes, in your communication, you don't realize you're leaving someone out. within the department that should be included, right? And how are you supposed to know that? So it was interesting.
Yeah, it sounds like you did a great job of being able to position yourself as a helper, helping say, hey, I'm here to help you get your lab back online instead of
Yeah, and this was a piece of a puzzle that you didn't know, right?
Exactly. Sean, Jonathan, have either of you had to deal with shutting down a lab due to a safety hazard?
Sean, you can go first if you'd like.
I think to just echo what Lori mentioned, we've had a few like that, nothing permanent, nothing where we had to sort of lock them out the door and throw away the key, but a lot where, you know, they had violations, we sort of had to put a pause on it and really try to make it, you know, we're here for safety, but we're also here for effectiveness. We want to make sure your work is safe and effective, really partner with them. I think more often than not, you know, they're not here for malicious reasons or anything. You know, they're here to do good work, and we want to make sure we help them get to that point and, you know, explain the risks, the liabilities, things they maybe don't quite grasp. And I think that's a big piece to partner with them.
Yeah, everything that Laurie and Sean said applies. The only thing I'll add to it is certainly gotten involved in this where they're not cooperating. And again, the role of an embedded safety professional is really doing a lot, as I think Laurie and Sean have said, a lot of the handholding, a lot of the helping of, it's not, you know, they're given performance-based standards and sometimes they just don't understand it. So years and years ago, we had an engineering lab and they were doing biosafety work and they weren't as familiar with the requirements, a lot of which are very performance-based. And the IBC, as Sean said, temporarily closed them down and they just couldn't understand it because they thought they were meeting the standard, but they weren't. So my chemical safety specialist and I had to do a lot of the handholding of, no, you can't have this for this type of enclosure or, you know, whatever it is, you really need something. Here's the sort of thing. No, it has to be this way or whatever. And what came back to me and I shared with the PI, and he and I became really very, very close over the years, was I said, look, I used to work for an engineer in a totally different context. One of the things he told me was, hey, John, make sure that our people know that neatness counts. You know, if people come in, regulators or internal, and see a site, a lab, whatever it is, and it looks nice and neat, they will have a very good feeling about that. But if they see a mess, even if it's all in compliance, but it's a mess, you know, they're going to have a very different feel for that. And so I said, understand in this, especially with biosafety, neatness absolutely counts. And that was, you know, maybe that's, you know, the analogy Sean was looking for before, but it did help him understand it. And like I said, helping the people so they can get back up. And as you said too, Matt, I think is one of the most important things. And as I've put, empathize with them on it.
Great. So next question here is from Linda asking, what do you do when a department moves labs around or gives a new lab space to a new PI that has not been cleaned out before arrival? They don't inform EH&S beforehand, so nor do they ask for our involvement. So is that something that any of you have had encountered in your experience? And certainly also open to our community. If anybody wants to chime in on that through their own experience, we'd love to hear about it in the Q&A.
Yeah, I literally was just doing this last week. So we had a PI depart because of you know, some academic issues. You know, his space was not necessarily the most clean, and then we had it's immediately being pivoted over to a new PI. So you know, I think the best advice I can give is really insert yourself in the situation. You know, oftentimes, more often than not, it's not going to be, you know, a fun time where, hey, let's get everyone together. We'll grab you. We'll grab you. You know, oftentimes we really have to assert ourselves. And I think, you know, the non-happy side of it is I think there's a lot of liability that needs to be translated to folks too, regulatorily. It's not always the most fun part of it, but I think it's a tool we need to remember that we have, because we are there for a purpose to make sure that these labs are compliant and safe and people can do their work safely. And I think explaining those things to upper levels can help get those resources to pivot those folks out, deal with those messes they left, deal with those hazards they left, and turn it over. I mean, we had when this person left, they had tons of has. We've got our CAA is now nicely full of wonderful treats they left over for us. So we had to deal with facilities. We've had to deal with our hazardous waste vendors. We've had to deal with cleaners. We found powders in places. We found, some things that had obviously reacted at some point in the distant past. And I think it really takes an all hands on deck approach. But my advice is really just put yourself in those situations, and you're there for a reason. That's really what you can't be bashful in these situations.
Lori?
Yeah, I think it's not so much if we've had this problem, it's which one of the many do you want to talk about? For me, briefly, I got a call from a brand new PI who said, "Hey, Jonathan, you don't know me, blah, 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 blah in this space. Can I get some help? I found fill in the blank hazardous chemicals." And you just never know what you're going to get. You thought the space was all cleaned out, et cetera. And it turns out in a back corner, whatever, as they're putting their new stuff in, no, it actually wasn't. So then, as I think Sean is really getting at, and I would say deal with reality. It's there. So, deal with it. What do you need to do? Trying to figure out how it happened, what happened, et cetera, is not the priority in the moment. The priority in the moment is dealing with that reality of figuring it out and taking care of it. Might be a whole bunch of stuff, might be one unique sort of thing. You just never know. And who do I need to call? Who's got to be there? I'll get my, haul myself over and figure it out, work with them, whatever it takes to get it done.
I really like that perspective as well of here's where we are. We can't change the past. We just need to move forwards. And that's also a great way to enforce some boundaries and say, hey, because you didn't inform me about this, now these several, more difficult, unpleasant, costly things are going to happen. And while we're also figuring out all of this really unfun, time-intensive stuff, let me paint a picture for you of how easy this could have been if you would just let me know ahead of time. So doing that kind of dual-pronged approach can sometimes help people to at least get the word out there, maybe share with their friends before it happens and catch a few of these events, and get them onto your plate before things progress too far.
Help build that culture of safety that we all strive to do.
Yeah, introduce yourself to people around your organization and say, hi, I'm a safety professional, and COVID has taught us that, if there's anything we know, it's that sometimes safety has to get involved when you're not expecting it. Great. Next question here is from Linda as well. Okay, let me just read this one through. It might be a repeat. Does anyone have experience with shutting down a lab due to serious and pervasive safety issues or regulatory compliance violations?
Well, I think it's, it is a little bit like the example I gave before of, it was unique where I was, that the IBC actually said this lab is now closed until they didn't put it this way, but get their act back together. It was a very, very serious step that had to come right from the chair of the IBC. It did not come from EH&S. And so, I think as all of us are saying, it certainly matters, and I get it, but there's a certain amount of, as Matt said, accept reality, right? And just deal with that. If they're being given the opportunity to get their act together, then, as Sean said, all hands. And how do you do it? And how do you make it happen as quick as possible, but in a way that's going to maintain that culture of safety, again, as Sean and I think all of us know so well that we strive for. Not sure if anyone ever quite gets there.
Gonna keep trying, though. That's the important part.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, somehow it is already 4 p.m. Eastern time, so this is the scheduled end time of our webinar, but we do have a few questions left in the Q&A that are unanswered. So now is one of those times where we'll ask our panelists if they're able to stick on for another couple minutes to help address those. But either way, a huge thank you to everybody for joining us today, for having this great conversation and making the space where we can share all this information. I'm so glad to have had a chance to be a part of as many of these, and really excited to see Jonathan go and take the helm on future webinars as well. So next question here is from Megan asking, do y'all require biological inventories? We currently do not, but I want us to. If you do, what detail do you require?
I wish. I think that's such a great idea. And if you can pull it off, please do it. It is so wonderful to have inventories, at least even of strains. I think I'll say bandwidth wise, where I currently exist, we don't have the ability to do etiological agents within our IBC. It just, we do BL3 obviously, but we just don't have the bandwidth. It's just not a big enough grouping of people that can actually do it. But other institutions I've worked with, they've done that. And just to sort of know what's in those freezers, even from a speciation standpoint, makes such a world of difference. So if you can pull it off, I highly, highly advise to.
Me as well. We don't currently do that either.
Yeah, and I will just add, I think that things always can be looked at between the binary of we can do it all and we can't do it at all. So what part of this can you do? Because every little bit can actually help, as long as people know it's not a 100% complete inventory. So if you can group things accordingly under certain categories of risk or type or whatever, at least you have that starting point, which can be helpful.
Oh, one quick trick, and this is for when labs are moving in that you may eventually have to close. I've found that we've had sometimes where labs come, they'll use movers that don't have hazardous certification to move materials. So
Yes.
one good trick there with those people moving in is you can say, hey, your mover, you're gonna need two movers. You're gonna need your HAZ mover and your non-HAZ mover. So we need to know what's in that freezer of biological materials, because that could have different hazardous categories as far as DOT goes. So maybe let us know that. And then you get a little bit of a picture and window in there. It helps.
Now, there have been a few questions, in the chat and the Q&A asking about Lori's checklists, and she has been very generous and shared those with us. They're all available for download on our webinar page as well. So if you go over to the page for how to gracefully shut down the lab group, you'll see those available for download. So a huge thank you to Lori for sharing those with everybody. I'm sure they'll be really appreciated. Great. And it looks like there's one last question here from Kai. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right there. Asking, do you give incentives for labs that comply with safety, and what are the incentives?
Goodwill, no. We don't have anything, unfortunately, but that would be a good idea too. Another way to sort of push that agenda.
Yeah, we don't have anything either right now.
I think from my standpoint, what we would do, it was very informal, is you can give them a certificate of appreciation, which will cost you absolutely zero and make a huge difference to them. At Arizona State, you could give Sun Awards, which were a very nice thing to do. But then also what was very meaningful to labs, of course, is to send them an email thanking them so much for everything that they did. And then you start copying in, like for me, my boss was a vice dean, or at UC Davis, it was the dean. Maybe you copy in someone in the Office of Research. PIs notice that, and they really appreciate it very, very much. So sometimes there are things that we can do that are very easy to do and will really resonate very strongly with the people that you're serving.
All right. Oh, Laura, you were going to say?
Oh, no. I was writing down Jonathan's ideas. I think that.
Well, this has been another fantastic discussion. A big thank you to you all for helping to make this possible, and also a big thank you to our attendees for joining us and for contributing all these great questions and ideas and thoughts. Thank you for just joining us for these webinars and for joining our future ones. And I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your week, a great weekend, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
And thank you, Matt, for everything you have done.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank
you,
you,
Matt.
These have been fantastic, Matt. So just thank you very much for all of these.
Oh, thank you. All right, I'll see you all later, and till next time.